Here are a bunch of buds of mine. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my dad, all heroes. We're not celebrating them today, we're celebrating everybody, but I'm using some of their characteristics to enhance us all and keep us reminded of certain things that are timeless and are not going to be forgotten by the next group of politicians or things like that. So we're going to talk about that. Now, we start. Oh, before I forget the last thing on women. Over 8 million women served directly in our armed forces in World War II. In all kinds of things. We've seen the assembly lines and all of that. Now, there were many that stayed at home on the number one job of all, taking care of kids whose dads were away. But the women, now I have to admit, this old platoon leader here, Army, it's taken me some time to get used to 3-star women generals. I don't know if I will ever get used to women in combat, but life changes, doesn't it? But what unbelievable creatures women are. Whoever came up with the description of weaker sex had a great sense of humor. You're smarter, stronger, and better looking than any of these men. So, all right. I hope I get through the rest of this that well, but I'll try. Major General Eben Swift. For all three of these men, I've tried to come up with one word, one adjective, and Eben Swift was simply brilliant. He was born in 1854. He passed 1 year before I was born. That was 1938. I never got to meet him, but I can assure you of talking with people that knew him and reading things like this journal that I'm going to read you a little passage out of. I think I know him as well as the other two and can't wait till we're all together one day and I'll finally get to meet him face to face. He graduated from West Point in 1876. He had first assignment in the western United States. He had a baptism under fire. He was a cavalry officer for 17 years fighting Indians. Then he was in the Spanish-American War, World War I. Had many commands, a soldier, scholar, and teacher. He was the father of the 5-paragraph field order and pamphlet entitled Military Orders, Messages, and Reports. And then an observer said years ago, no more important military guide or textbook was ever issued to our Army or any other than this done by Eben Swift. Do you guys still active, or do you use the 5-paragraph field order still? Yeah, I retired as a first lieutenant in 1965, so I'm a little out of touch, but I have a story for that to tell you in a minute too. Okay, after World War I, and moving the time up to 1942, we were getting ready for the big war, and a newly activated infantry division was moved into Bastrop, Texas. And how many have ever been to Camp Swift? Ron Clary has been to Camp Swift, and 2 days ago he told me how wonderful that was. It was just like a vacation up there to him. So maybe you all went and it wasn't a vacation to you. So anyway, they named that camp Camp Swift in 1942 in memory of this man. Now, here is his journal, which is a fascinating thing, just fascinating. But there's one story in this journal that caps them all. I've never heard anything like it. So here we go. It'll be short, but I think you'll like this. One very beautiful moonlight night in September, we were awakened by strange noises like someone calling and groaning. Going out, we found a soldier by the name of Maddox who had just been helped to the hospital by a soldier. Maddox had been over a creek to a Dutchman's store who sold liquor. Having filled up, he was on his way home, very happy, no doubt. And at the crossing of the creek, which was in deep banks, 5 or 6 Comanches waylaid him as he passed, shooting at him with bows and arrows. Maddox started running and ran until he met up with a soldier who heard the commotion and who brought him moaning and crying to the hospital. Now comes the incredible part of the story. 3 of these arrows had gone so far through him that the surgeon extracted them by cutting off the feathered end and pulling the rest of the arrow through his body. Maddox had 14 arrows in him and bristled like a porcupine. He was on his feet 2 weeks later and suffered no permanent injuries from that. I've often wondered what that Dutchman was selling him. Now we talk about grandfathers, and one of the points I'm going to talk about in a minute. Back in those days, it was a big thing where people went into town on Saturday, shopping and everything. Well, Eben Swift had 4 beautiful granddaughters who occasionally, where their husbands were stationed where he was. One of these women was my mother, so I heard this story from her. Well, Eben, and I always judge a man by this. If I meet a man that doesn't like ice cream, I don't trust him. Eben loved ice cream. And so they had these dairy deals, kind of the forerunner to Dairy Queen, I guess. And Eben would take the 4 granddaughters there, and they would sit there and eat banana splits and everything else there. However, Grandmother Swift did not want him eating banana splits, just like Marilyn and me. I can relate to this story real well. So anyway, they would be on the lookout for Grandmother Swift, and they would all be eating their deal. Well, anyway, whenever she would show up and walk in, he would put his banana split under the table, and they would just all sit there till she left. Now, that was the kind of guy he was. I'm really looking forward to meeting him. Well, another very colorful, dominating guy was his son over there. And he was Major General Palmer Swift. He was best described by this Life magazine that we'll talk about in a minute as stalwart. He was stalwart. But he was born in 1882. He passed in 1953. He graduated from West Point in 1904. His first assignment in the Horse Cavalry was at Fort Clark Springs at Brackettville. How many of you have driven by that on the way to Del Rio? Yeah, so that's where he started out. Then they sent him to the Philippines to fight the Moros. Then he goes to Fort Bliss, Texas, and for the first time, and he is on the punitive expedition into Mexico which was trying to catch Pancho Villa. They never caught Pancho Villa, but they did do some good down there. Then World War I hit, and he went to France for the duration of the war and fought there. Years later, he was the commanding general of Fort Bliss, Texas, in the 1st Cavalry Division. Now, there were some interesting things about that deal at Fort Bliss that aren't in the records of the official Army Times. He had 4 beautiful daughters. My dad and 2 other West Pointers went to Fort Bliss for their first station. They all 3 married one of the daughters. One of them, you may know. How many of you remember a 4-star general named Ralph Haynes? Any of you? Okay. Marilyn, where'd you put it? Right here. This is Ralph Haynes' swagger stick. 4 stars on it. He was a commanding general of Fort Hood, and he was made the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army and the Continental Arming Commander, which I'm sure most of you know this. The Continental Army, can anybody guess who the first commanding general of it was? That's right. So there was the history of that. So Ralph retired from that, and we were, like these others, we were buds. Well, one of the other lieutenants was named Loren Hilsinger. He was the only one-legged fighter pilot in World War II. He had his leg shot off on an aircraft carrier going over to fight the Japanese, and within a year, he had his new leg on and he was flying fighters over there. A rather rugged guy. He'd been an All-American football player both at Syracuse and West Point before they started counting how many years you'd been out on the football field. Okay, so also the other daughter of Palmer and Dinah Swift, and I'm going to tell you something. I've had so many blessings with people. Like David, I had 2 very spiritual grandmothers. Unlike David, he only had 1, and I gathered by that, knowing me, I needed 2. Okay, her name was Donna, but his youngest daughter was named Pam, and she was a qualified pilot when World War II started. Now that was rare, very rare, and she flew for the Flying Tigers during the war. So this thing goes deeper than what you're seeing up here, but I thought you'd be interested. All right. He went to the Philippines, commanded the 1st Corps there, culminating in the defeat of Japan. What kind of grandfather was he? Well, first of all, here's a tribute from someone you all know well in this district, his commanding officer and friend, Douglas MacArthur, who said, "No finer soldier has ever served his country like Palmer Swift." I think Douglas knew what he was looking at, and that was the best tribute of all of them, and there were many. Now, here's what he did for his 5-year-old grandson, me. Here's a letter that was sent from the Philippines, and he's inviting me to get over there and hang out with him. But it gets a little better, Northeast School District. I moved here and the Christmas break in 1952 to live with my grandparents until I completed high school. Believe it or not, and I signed up, of course, at Northeast Junior High, which was just a composite with Northeast Senior High. Well, the Northeast School District was a little short on school buses. Can you imagine that? The armada that you have out here now is incredible. Well, anyway, so those were the days that I would get on for a half a year. I got on the bus at what's now MacArthur High School, and it drove over to the Cerna Elementary School. You remember that on Austin Highway, where the budget car is now? Well, that was an elementary school. So we'd get off there. There was a convenience store. We'd go drink all the candy and we could drink soda and candy. And then another bus would pick us up and take us the rest of the journey. About 80% of the time, there was that rough cavalry general, a man who had been Patton's roommate at West Point. There he was sitting in his car waiting to take me home. Football started. He loved football. Many times when we were scrimmaging, right out there in that field, I would look over and there he was standing there with his bud, the first superintendent of Northeast School, Stanley Clayton Sr. He would have liked this guy too. The third thing, I had a little apartment in his house, and most nights he would come down and watch TV with me. Now there is the Palmer Swift that I will always remember. Colonel Hank Terri. His description is battler. Sometimes I feel sorry for the Germans that he fought. If he had been a lieutenant or a sergeant, he would have gotten the Medal of Honor. It would have been here instead of the DSC, no doubt about it. They didn't give lieutenant colonels medals of honor. That was just, you just didn't do that. And you say, well, boy, how old was he? He was about 30 years old, because when World War II started, we didn't have an army like we have today. We had an army that had a lot of questionable characters in the higher positions and a bunch of fresh graduates from West Point, Texas A&M, VMI, the Citadel, on and on and on. So these guys that were out of West Point for a few years, they were promoted because there was nobody else to promote to. But they didn't make any mistakes for that. He was in this picture as I was talking about Palmer Swift's daughters. My three uncles and my granddad are all in that picture there. Now, talking about that article and everything, Life magazine came out to Fort Bliss and wrote this incredible article. At that time, there was the beginning of transition from horse cavalry to armored tank cavalry was underway. There had been a strong group of people in the military that thought the Germans were going to attack us coming up through Mexico. And the best way to fight in Mexico and South America was horseback, not tanks. Well, anyway, quickly they could see that wasn't going to happen, so this huge transition started. Most of these soldiers there went into the armored part of the Army. And this is something else for all of you veterans. My dad got to Fort Benning, Georgia, to command an armor unit. They didn't have any tanks. They used broomsticks to practice tank maneuver till they started getting tanks. We were so far behind in this war. We were up against monsters who were well developed, and we had the men, though, with the hearts and wills and courage to overcome that. And all those women building the tanks now. That's probably why we didn't have any tanks. I think until then, men built tanks, but now we got the women in there. Okay. So, his unit, the 3rd Tank Battalion, was sent to Germany. And he quickly started earning these kind of medals. He became known as Task Force Cherry. He was a key figure in the Battle of the Bulge at Bastogne, and he's listed on a monument there. But there's somebody else that's mentioned on the monument there, and that's Bob Jones, Marilyn's dad. Our two dads fought together at Bastogne. I didn't know that until we got together. I never knew that. So that's something. Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I wanted to tell you about. And I'll be around after this thing here. Oh, and we're talking about these medals. There's George Patton there giving my dad this one here. And he signed it. So you had him as a very close friend and stablemate with my grandfather, George Patton, and then Patton and a guy named Abrams. Everybody remember Creighton Abrams tanks? Those were Patton's two top tank commanders in World War II. Those two men. Okay. Now, we return to the United States. And Hank Terri had a wonderful sense of humor. We drove up to the dock to get on our ship to come back. And it looked like something out of the Boxer Rebellion. And he said, I thought we won the war. Well, we came back on that terrible thing, sleeping like Marines in the hammocks under the water line, and it was something. Okay. He becomes the head of the armored department at West Point. And let me tell you something, those were my happiest years as a kid. I was like 9, 10, 11 there. Sports everywhere, the mountains, the Hudson River, all of that. But this is what I want you to hear about this man. We were coming out of the PX, and where it was located was across the plain where all the sports, intramural sports were played, where all the parades were, and a big plain, and on the other side was the cadet barracks and all of that. And we were walking over there, and I looked over there, and we stopped for a minute. It was dark. It was the only time I ever mentioned World War II to him. He never mentioned World War II to me. Most of the people that fought in World War II didn't talk about it. There were a bunch of people that didn't fight that talked about it all the time. Well, you can see here, he didn't talk about it. He qualified there. But I asked him a question about World War II. And he said something that is the best definition of courage I have ever heard. This man looked at me and he said, I was scared every minute. That's courage. That's what's represented in this room and many other places. Not some psychotic killer high on drugs that shoots everybody in a bar that's just happened again, but men like this and you. We're to carry this on. He received orders to Korea. We were stationed in Washington, D.C., and he was in the Pentagon, and he was going to be promoted to Brigadier General. He was 42 years old, and he got violently sick, and they went in, and he was eaten up with cancer, and he passed 3 or 4 months later. He, like Palmer Swift, had many wonderful tributes. Here's my favorite. He was a leader among leaders, a man among men, a twinkle in his eye, a warm voice, soft manner, wonderful sense of humor, never harsh, always helpful. Missed him every day of my life. Well, I told you I wanted to concentrate on 3 principles. The first one is honor, duty, country. I was raised, Jake, you don't have to make this a career, but you need to serve and you need to be ready if the flag goes up. Well, I followed that, and the last time I think I did anything, I knew what the answer was going to be. This was not to edify me in any way. It was to edify that man on the other end of the phone. So I called the Army Enlistment office here in San Antonio, and a sergeant answered. And I said, Sergeant, I am furious about 9/11. Can you use an old platoon leader? And he says, how old is this platoon leader? Now this was 17 years ago, so now you're going to find out what you're thinking. I was 62 then, and he said, sir, you can sit this one out. But I started thinking about, why in the world did you do that, Jake? At least I could edify someone that was going to have to go do it, and he realized a lot of us, if called on, and we could, we would do it. Just like Brian's issuance to me, same thing. And that's what's in this room right now. And I'll be 80 next year, and I'll go if they call me and there's something to do. The second thing, I think you might agree this is a pretty tough group that I'm surrounded by here. That's true. But here's something we all must also strive. We must strive to always be tough-minded but tender-hearted. Don't ever get that mixed. The last thing. We are to be spiritual people in all that we do. That's why I do what I do, and I know all of you are in that same position. Thank you, and God bless.